Hey folks, thanks for stopping by and welcome back to another episode on my YouTube channel Czechoslovak Gun Stories. Today we are going to have a look at how Czechoslovakia helped Israel to fight for their independence. The former Czechoslovakia, especially the Czech part of the country, had a sad role in the World War II, in that it was the first country to get occupied by the Nazis and the last one to be liberated. It, however, was also lucky in one way. Being liberated as the very last country, the worst and toughest battles during which the whole cities and their infrastructure were wiped out did not occur here, except my hometown, whose fate is known as the Czechoslovak Stalingrad. So the infrastructure, including the arms factories, remained more or less intact compared to other countries like Germany, for example. That all means that it kept producing the firearms for the Nazis until the very last moment of the war. I don't have to emphasize how much the Czechoslovak firearms industry had to offer even before the war, and both the firearms development and production did not stop during the occupation. It also means that there were thousands and thousands of German soldiers surrendering in the country to both Soviets and American troops when the war ended. Many of them just threw their guns away, abandoned their tanks, etc. Others handed them over to the authorities. The result was that the Czechoslovakia had plenty of warehouses full of weapons and ammo, from pistols and rifles through machine guns, artillery, all planes in various conditions. For a brief moment, the newly established Czechoslovak forces used this stuff, but very soon the army realized that they need to equip their soldiers with a standardized gear in order to make training as well as maintenance easier. There were three actual choices. Choice number 1. The Czechoslovak army would get a full-scale Soviet equipment. That was not reasonable, though, making the country too dependent on the Soviets. Option number 2. Use the leftovers from Germans, which was the case in a very early post-war month, when the backbone of the army was still the rifle known as VZ-98N. It was the famous Kar 98K in different iterations. This was, however, very unsustainable, because the gear was wearing out quickly, and for a large part of them the spare parts were just unavailable. And there was option number 3. Design our own gear, which would be modern, with available spare parts, and also ready for export in the future. As we know today, the Czechoslovaks went with option number 3. It was a smart option, but now you have warehouses full of military equipment, ammo, etc., and no use for that. It was a mixture of pre-war Czechoslovak weaponry, wartime German stuff, both brand new, manufactured here, and milsurp, but also Soviet gear our soldiers fighting in the Red Army brought back, as well as British and American arsenal from the Czechoslovak soldiers fighting in the West. There was a real mixture of stuff. You may be wondering, what did they do? Did they scrap all that? Or did they sell it? And if, to whom? The whole world was flooded with cheap milsurp material that no one needed, right? Well, there was one country that strongly needed any military equipment available. The country that was ready to buy anything for almost any price. If you guessed it might have been Israel, you'd be right. Back in the day, Israel was not even a country, but they struggled to become one, and they were sure that there's going to be a lot of heat if they declare independence. Unfortunately, the newly established United Nations was desperately trying to keep peace between the Jews and Palestinians, and the way to do that was an embargo to import of military equipment to the country. The predecessor of the IDF, known as Haganah, started their struggle with a variety of weapons. Some were British, because obviously if the Brits controlled the territory, some of their weapons made it to the hands of the Israelis. The mixture also contained some captured guns, hunting weapons, and some were even homemade. We are talking merely about small arms, no artillery, tanks, or planes, unlike their Arab enemies. Soon they started looking for more advanced weaponry, but they found out that no one was willing to sell them anything. As it turned out, almost all countries respected the embargo of the newly established United Nations. Czechoslovakia was the only country that was willing to overcome the embargo and sell the military equipment to the Israelis via the Jewish Agency for Israel. It took over 2 years between July 1947 and October 1949 to train and equip the core of the Israeli army to be able to defend their independence. Over that period of time, the Israelis were delivered 34,507 Kar-98 rifles of various models, 5,515 MG-34 machine guns including 10,000 ammo belts, 10,000 bayonets, 900 heavy machine guns VZ-37, 500 Chesed VZ-27 pistols, 12 ZK-383 submachine guns, 10 ZK-420 rifles, and 500 ZB VZ-26 light machine guns. As for the ammo, the Czechoslovaks delivered 91.5 million of 7.92 mm Mauser rounds, 50 million of 9 mm Luger rounds, 375,000 13 mm rounds for MG-131 cannon, 150,000 of 20 mm rounds for MG-151 cannon, 375,000 rounds of 7.65 Browning /32 ACP for pistols. That was not all, however. The Israelis also strongly needed to build their own air force, so they received 25 Avia 199 fighters, which were Czechoslovak versions of Bf-109, 61 Spitfires Mark 9E, including ammo. Extremely interesting was a deal for 20 pieces of 500 kg bombs and 30 pieces of 250 kg bombs that were loaded in July 1948 into the B-17 bombers in the Czechoslovakia. But instead of being delivered to Israel, the Israelis decided to unload the cargo directly over the Cairo. Czechs also delivered spare parts for these planes, although majority of the planes only arrived after the end of the war. Some of them flew straight to Israel with a stopover in Yugoslavia. These were masked as Yugoslavia Air Force planes. Others were transported disassembled and marked as scrap iron via cargo planes and boats. Israelis were also interested in purchasing the APCs, light Praga tanks, and Hetzer tank destroyers, but before this deal was closed, the Czechoslovak support had ceased. Obviously, the purchase of military equipment would not help much without the proper training. The Czechoslovak instructors trained the Jewish soldiers within the secret operation called DI. In Czech, that means Důvěrné Israel. In English, Classified Israel. In total, 1,335 Israeli men and women, including 81 pilots, received training for service within air forces, radio operating units, airborne units, and also armored units. The commander of the training of Israeli in the Czechoslovakia was one of our national heroes, Major Antonín Suchor. In a way, we can say that the Czechoslovaks helped to defend the independence of Israel and establish IDF, which became one of the most professional and respected armies around the world. Such a huge logistic operation, obviously, could not be kept secret, and when the US found out, they demanded at the UN that the Czechoslovakia ceases the supply activities immediately. Part of the delivery was covered by the Ethiopian Empire, who acted as a middleman. Other large portion was smuggled into the country under the delivery of potatoes, onions, etc. The most important deliveries were transported via the top-secret air bridge between the Czechoslovakia and Israel, and the earliest ones helped to break through the Arab lines and liberate the besieged Jerusalem in April 1948. You may be asking, why the Czechoslovaks supported Israel in the first place? Well, there are several reasons why, so let's have a look at them. Reason number 1, sympathies towards Zionism. In case of our last pre-war and the first post-war president, Edvard Beneš, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jan Masaryk, the son of our president liberator, T.G. Masaryk, the main reason was a sympathy with the Jewish struggle. After all, many of them fled Czechoslovakia from Hitler before the war, and those lucky who survived moved to Israel after the war. Czechoslovakia at the time also helped to organize transport of fleeing Jews to Israel, as the post-war Europe was still far from the safe place for them. Apart from this chivalric attitude of our democratic politicians, there were also other reasons. Since the end of the war, the communists were creepingly taking over, and after the February of 1948 communist putsch, only two reasons for the support of Israel remained. Reason number one was the political reason. The Moscow, under whose influence the Czechoslovakia fell immediately after the war, wanted to export communism to the Middle East, and Israel seemed to be a good place to start. Obviously, it would be unacceptable for Soviets to get involved directly, so they needed a proxy country, the Czechoslovakia. Once they found out there's just no way to turn Israel into the socialist state, they ordered the Czechoslovaks to cease the deliveries, and in the following years they refocused to supply neighboring Arab countries. The reason number two was the financial reason. Since the Israelis were desperate and very solvent, the Czechoslovakia sold the useless and second-hand gear for extremely high prices. Czechs, on the other hand, needed Western currencies, as they were forced by the Soviets to reject Marshall Plan, and so they had to buy whatever was unavailable within the forming Eastern Bloc in the West. I'm sure the extremely high prices Israelis were ready to pay helped to persuade especially those who were afraid of consequences if somebody spilled the beans and the United Nations found out that Czechoslovakia is smuggling guns despite their embargo. Just for you to get an idea, only within the single year of 1948, the Israelis paid $12,378,957 for the delivered material. In today's figures, it would be a sale worth of over $131 million. No wonder if the ordinary Milsurp fighter plane was available for around $5,000, whereas the Czechoslovaks were selling their Avia 199 fighter planes for $44,000, so almost 10 times that much. The delivery of military material and training of Israeli troops was not the only way the Czechoslovaks assisted Israel, though. There was a couple of groups of military observers traveling across the Czechoslovakia, visiting various factories, especially arms factories, collecting information for a future Israeli weapons industry. One of them was a chap named Uzziel Gal. That's a different story though. We'll cover it in one of the future episodes on the channel. So, don't forget to subscribe, like the video if you learned something new, and also feel free to ask anything in the comments. It's there for you. So that's all for today, and until next time.